In this second lecture on World War II, the European theater, we're going to pick up where we left off at the end of the last lecture, and that was the Casablanca Conference. And we were discussing the idea of unconditional surrender, that is, the total defeat and then ultimate occupation of Germany at the end of the war, to create to leave no doubt about the end of the war and about how the war ended, and that was going to again be total defeat. That had not happened at the end of World War I, something that Hitler used to his advantage in the 1930s as he rebuilt the German nation and the German war machine in particular to deadly effect. So the Allied leaders decided that there would be no negotiating, no separate pieces. And again, that's something Stalin's not at this meeting. So there's the fear and suspicion on Stalin's part, a paranoid man to begin with, that the Americans and the English were going to somehow collaborate together to the detriment of the Soviet Union. So the fact that Stalin's not here is important, though Stalin claimed he couldn't leave because of the war in the Soviet Union. So this is going to be another one of those points that we want to try to remember as the war comes to an end and we look to after the war and what happens. So was this idea of unconditional strategy a good one? And I think on the one hand it is, because given the history of World War I and how it ended, we didn't want to have a repeat. That is, we didn't want to leave an opening for a future German government and or leader that was going to again cause trouble on a massive scale. So it is a good idea in that sense, because there's no peace settlements, no diplomacy. However, on the other hand, it wasn't a good idea, because what it meant was it committed the Allies to fighting to the death. And this meant that the war would drag on longer. There would be more deaths, more casualties, more destruction, more cost, because there wouldn't be a negotiated settlement that would bring about an earlier end to the war. So on one hand, it's a good idea because you don't want to repeat the past. On the other hand, it's not a good idea because you're really saying to the Germans and to the Japanese that this is a fight to the death, and that's what it became. And yet the Allies win, but it was going to take 3 more years of fighting, more deaths, more casualties, more destruction, and more cost. So unconditional surrender had its drawbacks. The other thing that they agreed to at the Casablanca Conference was a continuation of what we will call the Southern Strategy. And you see on this map here, the areas that are shaded are those that are occupied by Germany. And the idea was the Allies were going to come in and try to encircle them. Remember that the Soviet Union is off to the east, and they've begun to push back on the German army. And the United States and Britain plan to come in through the Mediterranean and sweep northward. So that was the next phase of the war in Europe. And that was going to be known as Operation Husky, which took place in July of 1943. The British and Americans invaded the Italian island of Sicily. And that's something they had agreed to at Casablanca. And in short order, the Italians are defeated. And on July 25th, 1943, the fascist dictator, Benito Mussolini, was deposed and arrested. He would ultimately be freed from captivity by his German friends, Hitler, that is, and put in charge of what is known as a puppet state in northern Italy for the duration of World War II. However, what the Germans did after the Italians dropped out, and the Italians, by the way, try to join the Allied side, that is, they want to join the remnants of the Italian state and army that arrested Mussolini and overthrew him, want to join with the Americans and the British, and the Americans and the British are somewhat suspicious and skeptical of Italian intentions and their word, having been run by Mussolini, governed by Mussolini for the past 20 years. So that was going to create some uneasy relationships there. However, the Germans decided that they did not want to give up the Italian peninsula to the English and the Americans, and they ordered hundreds of thousands of troops to Italy, and the Germans mounted a stiff and bloody resistance to the Allied forces, who were then from Sicily invading the mainland of Italy. And it led to a great many deaths and the destruction of a great many artistic and architectural treasures, again through this air bombing strategy that had been adopted. And Monte Cassino is one such example, a famous medieval monastery dating back to the 6th century. That's the 500s, that had been a center of learning and study and reflection on a mountaintop outside of Naples is completely obliterated by bombing as the Germans had entrenched themselves in this hilltop monastery. The only way to dislodge them, thought the Allies, was to bomb the thing to bits, and that's what they did. The German army would only surrender in Italy in May of 1945. So the Italian campaign is going to be a 2-year campaign, extremely bloody, very costly in terms of deaths. It did create somewhat of a diversion that Stalin had wanted, but it still was not the main objective that Stalin had been asking for, which was an invasion of northern France and then to sweep the Germans back into Germany. The one thing that it did do, however, was it delayed that campaign. So Stalin wanted that northern campaign, and it's going to be delayed in large part because the Allies get bogged down and stuck in this fighting in Italy. And in one case, there was an amphibious invasion of the town of Anzio outside of Rome. And again, it hadn't gone well. It bogged down. It broke down, which gave Churchill even more reason to say, we're not really prepared to invade cross-channel northern France, from England, that is. So again, the effects of the Italian campaign are going to be to slow and delay the opening of a second front in northern Europe. So from that, we will go on to the Cairo Conference. This is the second of the conferences. This was November 25, 26, 1943. And at this conference in Egypt, Roosevelt and Churchill again met with the leader of China, Chiang Kai-shek, an ally of the United States and the British against the Japanese. Again, the idea was to reassure Chiang that the United States intended to continue its support of China and the peoples of China against the Japanese and their aggressions, and they were going to increase attacks. The other idea that comes up at this conference, and again, Stalin is not here, again, an important thing, was Roosevelt's idea of the 4 policemen of the world. And Roosevelt really began to think about the post-war period, and he said there has to be not only a new League of Nations, that's something that will be discussed, and that will be called the United Nations, but there has to be an agreement of the principal powers in the world, the United States, Great Britain, and China, in addition to the Soviet Union, that are going to be the policemen. That is, they're going to be responsible for carrying out or maintaining the peace and dealing with troubles as they arrive. And Roosevelt wanted to elevate China to this status of world power in the Pacific region after the defeat of Japan. And that was an interesting idea. Again, I'm not sure Stalin agreed in total with that idea, but again, he's not there. And you can see these leaders pictured at the Cairo Conference, and you can see the New York Times headline that crushing of Japan mapped out at the Cairo Parley, and that was what they did. They planned to ultimately wipe out Japan as the war in Europe is still raging. So that's a brief interlude, the Cairo Conference, the 4 policemen. We're now going to shift our attention to the next major conference, which took place several days after the Cairo Conference. So again, you can see these conferences occurring with some frequency. November 28th to December 1st. This time it took place in the capital of Tehran, which was a nation that was close to the Soviet Union. So this time Stalin is in attendance, and it's the first meeting of what we call the Big Three. And what happened at this conference was the leaders agreed to military strategy for the rest of the war in Europe. And the U.S. and Britain at this point agreed to an invasion of northern France, crossing the English Channel and opening what was known as the Second Front. And this was going to take place May 1944. That was the promise at Tehran. And again, Churchill is still resistant to this idea. Roosevelt at this point makes the pledge and promise to Stalin because Roosevelt began to understand that somebody was going to have to work with the Soviet Union and Stalin as the war progressed and as the war ended. So Roosevelt, I think, has a vision here, and I think he deserves some credit. Roosevelt was a very personable, happy, charming kind of individual. Joseph Stalin, again, a bit paranoid, reserved, really hard to read him on a personal level, and so Roosevelt's going to use his powers of charm and persuasion with Stalin to some success, I think. And the idea was Roosevelt agrees to the cross-channel invasion, the Second Front. Other topics that would be discussed would be the Soviet willingness to enter the war against Japan once Germany had been defeated. So the United States is going to gain valuable help in defeating Japan in the Pacific from the Soviet Union. Another thing that came up was the question of Poland, and what the Soviet Union and Stalin in particular wanted. He wanted a great chunk of Poland, and you can see a map of Poland there. I know it's not obvious to you that that's Poland, but it is. That area in blue is part of eastern Poland, and that's the area that Stalin claimed that he wanted for his people and as a security buffer or a security zone against Germany. And so what Roosevelt says is, well, look, that's fine. I understand your need for security, but I also am the president of a democratic nation where we hold free elections. And 1944 was an upcoming presidential election year. And yes, Roosevelt was going to run again for a fourth term, unprecedented. And he says to Stalin, at least if we're going to give in and give you this territory of Poland, you could help me at home in the United States by announcing that you're going to hold free elections and that the Polish people will ultimately decide. And so that's something that they discuss and they kind of work out. But you can already see trouble appearing on the horizons. And again, I'm trying to give you the idea that even though the war is going on and the Allies are winning that war, we start to see signs that are troubling. And we see those now in retrospect. I'm not sure that they were visible then, but nonetheless, the Polish agreement was reached. Now, they were also going to take part of Germany and put it on to Poland in the west, and those are those yellow territories. So Poland wasn't going to completely suffer as a result of this agreement. The last thing that came up was discussion of a new League of Nations, and so that there were commitments made by the three allies that the League of Nations, now called the United Nations, would be responsible for promoting peace and maintaining peace in the world. And that was important because Roosevelt, had said to Stalin at this meeting, and this is also interesting, that he and the United States did not intend to keep troops in Europe after the war. So Roosevelt's already announcing to Stalin that the United States is going to bring its troops home, and that sort of reverts back to that idea of neutrality and isolation. And why does Roosevelt do that? Well, I think Roosevelt does that because he feels that this new League of Nations called the United Nations will be the body, this international or multinational body that will keep peace, and it won't require U.S. troops. Stalin, on the other hand, sees this as a potential thing to exploit, possibly a sign of weakness that, hey, the United States is going to withdraw its troops after the war. That leaves the Soviet Union, in charge of affairs in Europe. So Stalin agrees to this idea of a League of Nations or United Nations, I think maybe for that reason. So that's the Teheran Conference, a very important conference, and the leaders would next meet at Yalta in February of 1945, so about 14 months later. So we'll move on to the last thing in this lecture, and that is D-Day. And I'm not sure we're going to get through D-Day. In fact, I may just suspend the lecture here, but the long-awaited Second Front does finally come in June of 1944. Now, it had been promised in May, and yet there were another series of delays. And again, every time there's a delay, we have to think about what that means to the Soviet Union and what that means in particular to Stalin. So May 1st to June 6th doesn't seem like a large delay, yet the Soviets had all along really questioned whether the United States were serious about launching a second front in northern France. Well, they were. It just took a lot longer to get things in place for this massive sea invasion. You had over 1 million men in England in arms. You had to then transport them across the English Channel. Not an easy body of water to do. you can see that I drew some arrows there to the map. The invasion, at least the Germans felt the invasion was going to take place at Calais, and that is the area where England and France are closest, and that would have made the most sense.